To save some typing, grab 3 simple React components from the Before folder for this module: text input and select input, which are in the common folder. Form utilize new file. I'm importing React and prop types. I'm importing a text input and a select input, which we will create in a moment. This is a functional component, and I'm destructuring props in the argument. The form itself has a form tag with an onSubmit that will call the onSave passed in on props. I have a header that changes based on whether the course ID is passed in. If there's no course ID, then I label it Add Course instead of Edit Course. I have a spot to display errors, which we'll implement. And then down below, nothing too surprising, I have inputs for each of the different pieces of data that we're going to allow someone to input: the title, the author ID, and the category. We're passing on-change handlers to these, as well as any errors that might occur during validation. Down at the bottom, we have our Submit button. And while it is saving, it will change the label from saving to save. And finally, at the bottom, we have our prop types declarations. In the next clip, let's create the text input and select input components that we're referencing here. Now we need to create the reusable components for handling text inputs and select inputs on forms. Since they're common components that are likely to be used in a number of spots, let's place them over here in the common folder. I'll say New File and put in textinput.js. Another functional component. I'm adding some classes that come from Bootstrap, wrapping our input in a div, putting the label in, and then also wrapping our input itself in a div with a class name of field. So this will look very nice, and our consumers won't have to do much work to interact with this. These are basically the same components that I created from scratch in my React and Flux course, so check that course if you want to see these created by hand in a little more detail. What's handy about these components is they encapsulate the necessary Bootstrap markup and styling, which will make them look great and consistent. Let's go create our select input as well. Components, an array of options. Set the key again, specify, help greatly reduce our app. In the next clip, I think we're ready to put our course form to use. Now that we've created the necessary components, let's reference Manage Course Form here in Manage Course Page. We need to pass course data to the course form, so we need to update map state to props to pass an empty course that will get us started. I declared the empty course structure in mockdata.js, so let's import that as well. Then jump down to the bottom to map state to props. We'll pass in that new course that we imported up above on props. And up here on prop type, types, let's also declare that empty course with a proptypes.object.isRequired. Our form will need state to hold the form field values before they're saved, so let's jump up to the top and set some state on this component. Our form needs state to hold the form field values before they're saved, so let's set up some local state on this component. Since we're using React hooks, let's go to the top and import the useState hook. useState is a hook that lets us add React state to function components. We can declare our state down here inside our function component. I'm going to declare course as our state and the setter as setCourse. We will call useState, and for the default value, we'd like to set it to the course that's getting passed in on props. Let's talk through this. useState returns a pair of values. We use array destructuring syntax to assign each value a name. The first value is the state variable, and the second value is the setter function for that variable. useState accepts a default argument. We're specifying that it should initialize our course state variable to a copy of the course passed in on props. Now, we can see some red squigglies here, and that's because props isn't defined because we're not destructuring it up here in the signature. And this produces an interesting conflict because I can't destructure it right here, or it will cause ambiguity between the course passed in on props and our course object declared on line 10. So instead, what I'm going to do is use the REST operator to assign any properties that we haven't destructured to an object called props. Now we can see that this code no longer has an error. The REST operator uses the same three-dot syntax as the spread operator. And for the default value, we'd like to set it to the course that's getting passed in on props. Let's talk through this. useState returns a pair of values. We use array destructuring syntax to assign each value a name. The first value is the state variable, and the second value is the setter function for that variable. useState accepts a default argument. We're specifying that it should initialize our course state variable to a copy of the course passed in on props. Now, we can see some red squigglies here, and that's because props isn't defined because we're not destructuring it up here in the signature. And this produces an interesting conflict because I can't destructure it right here, or it will cause ambiguity between the course passed in on props and our course object declared on line 10. Props operator. So here, the REST operator stores any properties that we haven't destructured on the left here in a variable called props. This allows us to reference props.course below and avoids us having two different variables called course. One other option you could consider is to alias course as initial course within the destructuring statement. Two different ways to resolve this conflict, but I'm going to go with the original approach. And when I hit save, prettier reformats. Before we move on, note that I'm using React State. Now, you might be wondering why I'm not using Redux to hold this form state. And the reason is that's typically unnecessary and it leads to extra complexity. Avoid using Redux for all your state. Plain React State remains useful for local state. Use Redux for more global values. So if you're wondering when to use local form state versus Redux, ask yourself, who cares about this data? If only one component or a small related group of components cares about the data, then just use plain React State. Keep it local. Typically, with a form, only a single component cares about the unsaved data, so local React State makes sense for most forms. Is part of our course form of our render function. We can eliminate the header, since that is part of our course form component. We don't need the fragments anymore either. Instead, we will call course form, and we will pass it the course and the heirs, as well as the authors. Notice that I'm referencing errors, but we haven't declared that yet in state. Let's jump back up here quickly and do that. I'm going to copy this line just to make it easier. We're going to initialize errors to an empty object. We'll name the setter set errors. And we'll name the state variable errors. So this state will hold any errors that occur when we run validation later in the course. All right, this should get us rolling. Let's jump back to the browser and see how it looks so far. We need to load /course manually because we haven't yet created a way to navigate here. But great, we now have the form rendering. And it looks very nice in a vanilla, lame, oh man, I've seen this 1,000 times before, those in a moment. So what's next? Well, if I try typing in any of these form fields, not much happens. Looks like we need some change handlers. We have our form displaying, so the next obvious issue is we can't type in the form fields. Why? Well, because they're managed components and we haven't defined a change handler. So let's add a change handler. I'm going to declare a single change handler for all of our form fields. Now, if you look at course form, you'll see that each one of the inputs has a name which corresponds to the property that it displays. For instance, the category input has a name called category and its value is set to course.category. This allows me to update the corresponding value in state with a single function. So let's declare that single change handler. We'll call the function handleChange, and it will accept an event. First, I'm going to do destructuring of that event at the top, and we'll see why this is useful here in a moment. Then we'll call setCourse, and we will use the functional form of setState. Remember, you can pass either an object or a function to setState. I'm using the functional form of setState here so that I can safely reference the previous state as I set new state. Here I'm using JavaScript's computed property syntax so that I can reference a property using a variable. So, for example, if the input that just changed was the title field, this code is equivalent to saying course.title. Quite handy. And this approach is also outlined in the React docs. Then we need to handle the value differently depending on whether we're working with the author ID or any other value. Since we need to handle the author ID as a number, I call parseInt to convert that value to a number. Otherwise, I use the value that was passed in on the event directly. Even though we're storing the ID as an int, it will be returned as a string in the event. So I'm using parseInt to convert the ID back to an int. Note that I'm destructuring here at the top. This shortens the calls below, which is nice, but it's also necessary in this case so that we can access the event inside the setState function. Without this destructuring statement, we get the error that this synthetic event is reused for performance reasons. Why? Well, that's because the synthetic event is no longer defined within the async function. Destructuring on the first line avoids that error because it allows us to retain a local reference to the event. Now that we've declared our change handler, we can come down here and pass it in on props. Say onChange is equal to handle change. Hit save, prettier reformats that. Again, this is a nice thing about functional components and React hooks. Notice how we don't have the this keyword littered all over the place. We have nice short calls to local variables that are scoped to our function. And with our change handler declared, we should be able to jump back over to the browser. And now we can type within the fields. That's a good thing. Our form needs a save function, so we're going to need to create a new action. So open courseactions.js and we'll create a new thunk called saveCourse. And this is extremely similar to our load courses thunk, so I'll just paste this in and point out the minor differences. We'll put it down here at the bottom. So this thunk looks quite similar to our load courses thunk up above, except we are calling save course instead of get courses. And another difference is that we want to dispatch different actions depending on whether we are creating a new course or updating an existing course. We determine that by looking at whether a course ID exists. If there's an ID, then we know we want to update an existing course. Otherwise, we know we want to create a course instead. One other thing to note is, although I'm going to pass the course in from the form, you may choose to access the store state within your thunk without having to pass the data all into your thunk. The second parameter that you see right here is optional. And if I had set a breakpoint and watched this parameter, I'd see that getState has all of our Redux store's state inside. Now in this case, I don't need this feature, but I wanted you to be aware of it since this can be handy. So our next step is to resolve these red lines down here because we haven't declared either of these action creator functions yet. So let's jump up top. Since I like to keep all the action creator functions here at the top, and we'll create these two functions. And we can see that we also need to go create the corresponding constants. So let's open action types.js. I'll add these two new action types in for create course success and update course success. While we're in here, we can also jump up here and remove this first action creator because we're not using it anymore. Our create course success and update course success action creators have replaced this old one. Now that our new thunk and action creators are set up, let's shift our focus to the reducer in the next clip.